Hi everyone, welcome back to Science Breakdown, where I deep dive into a scientific announcement, pull apart the original research to figure out if it's an actual incredible breakthrough or just fancy clickbait. Today we are going to dig into this tweet that brags that you can replace your chemotherapy with coffee. And he cites his sources, so it must be correct, right? Right? So first, a few disclaimers, as this is quite a touchy subject. There are often breakthroughs in science, but those are made by doctors or scientists who have gone through an extensive process of trial and error, who have spent sometimes their entire life working on this dedicated topic, and who had the proper funds and proper methods to test it accurately. In parallel, there are also food, beverages, or just substances that can improve your health in general, but those cannot cure your cancer. There are so many predatory people on the internet that are just trying to take the money of vulnerable people who feel like they have to try anything to get better. I more than understand the feeling, as well as the growing concerns that doctors don't really listen to you, they don't consider anything that's not in their medical textbooks, and also they can exhibit sexist or racist behaviors. And I really understand the feeling that is sometimes very valid, but that does not mean you have to go off of your prescribed medication to test some random herb that some dude is selling. This will not help you, and this is a very, very, very dangerous and predatory practice. I could honestly make hundreds of videos being based on this product cures your cancer, you should go off your treatment and eat only this, and this product causes cancer, you should never eat it again. And sometimes one product is in both of those categories depending on who you ask. That being said, now let's get back to the tweet and see, looking at the sources this person provided, if coffee can replace chemotherapy. So the first paper that this person presents is this one, which I found the title and abstract on PubMed, which is basically a library of scientific papers. And immediately when you look at that paper, a few things jump out. First, the paper is in Japanese, not in English. It does not mean it's a bad paper, but usually big or breakthrough research will be published in English to reach the most amount of people. Second thing, the IF is 0.07.
Bond. James Bond.
So IF means impact factor, and basically it's a number that tells you how much you can trust the journal that is publishing that article. And I will make another video on impact factors because it's a very quick way to kind of have a first estimation on whether or not you can trust a source. But very simply put, the higher the better. In biology, an impact factor of 4-6 is already starting to be credible. And the three best papers in biology, the three best journals in biology, Nature, Science, and Cells, all have an impact factor between around 45 and 50. So you can see that 0.07
Bond. James Bond
is very low. And personally, I would not cite this paper into any of my research, especially because I can't read Japanese. Third point. This paper was published in 1998. This is not a recent breakthrough. And fourth point, and maybe the most important one, and the reason why I will not try to dig into it whatsoever, is that this paper does not talk about coffee. Not even a little bit. It talks about replacing your normal chemotherapy treatment with intravenous chemotherapy treatment. So still chemotherapy. So absolutely off topic. Next. Second paper is this one. From the get-go, you can see that the impact factor is already quite high and that it has been published in 2024, so I will not dismiss it like I did with the previous one. Also, very importantly, as you can see in the title, I will only talk about colorectal cancer, because that is what this paper talk about. So even if this paper was telling you to replace your chemo with coffee, which is not the case, it would only be for that specific cancer. Things cannot be extrapolated without further research. Okay, let's dig into it. What did they do? They evaluated a questionnaire taken by 1,700 people who had colorectal cancer. 1,700 people is a big group of people in research. It's called a cohort, and it's quite a big number, so you can already feel like you can trust it. They had stage 1 to 3 colorectal cancer. They followed the people for a median of 6 years, so half of them will follow for less, half of them will follow for more, but overall they evaluated people over a 10-year period. Their study is a prospective study, which means that they chose the patients at the beginning and then they followed them throughout the years. And the last thing is that they evaluated two things. They evaluated the recurrence of the cancer, so if the cancer would come back, and the all-cause mortality, so if the people died or not, and regardless of if they died of cancer or not of cancer. And they tried to correlate the risk of having a cancer coming back and the risk of overall death with how much cups of coffee you were drinking per day. So they also collected, on top of how many cups of coffee they were drinking per day, information on sex, height, weights, and smoking habits and education. Which is very important because then they could assess if the death or recurrence of the cancer would be correlated with any of those other factors. Unfortunately, they did not take into account socioeconomic status, even though most scientists agree that it is very important when you're studying mortality because it's a very important factor, but the questionnaire that they got just didn't have that question in it. They also did not make a distinction between caffeinated and decaffeinated coffee, which is a little bit of a shame, but they also stated that they did that research in the Netherlands where almost nobody drinks decaf. And the third point that I am not super pleased about is that they did not isolate the people who drank no coffee at all, but that was just because they didn't have enough people in that category, so they just grouped the 0 people into like less than 2 cups per day. So this is the only figure of the paper. Don't get scared, I know it looks a little bit complicated, I'm gonna explain it. First, let's focus on figure A, which is the recurrence. Here you can see on the x-axis that they represented the amount of cups of coffee drank per day from 0 to 8, and on the y-axis the risk of getting your cancer again, so the risk of recurrence. A risk of 1 here means that compared to the control, which is 2 cups of coffee per day, you do not get a higher or lower risk. An HR, so a risk higher than 1 means that you have a higher risk, and a risk lower than 1 means that you get a smaller chance of getting your cancer back. The solid black line here is their results, so their average, whereas the 2 dotted lines are their interval of confidence. So not gonna lie, confidence intervals are not the easiest notion to understand, but I'll try to make it very easy for you. If you have a confidence interval of 95%, which is what they have, if your data falls between those 2 dotted lines, you have only 5% chance of being wrong. If you have a confidence interval of 99% and your data falls between the 2 dotted line, you have only 1% chance of being wrong. So the higher your confidence interval, the best it is, and also you can imagine that the closest the 2 dotted lines or your confidence interval are to each other, the best it is, because that means if your data falls into this, you have 99% chance that it actually falls in between those 2 lines. Whereas if the lines are very far away from each other, it means that, sure, maybe your data is here, but it could also be here, it could also be here. It has 99% chance of being in that big range. On this graph, you can see that if you take less than 2 cups a day of coffee, you have a higher chance of getting your cancer back. But if you take more than 2 cups of coffee per day, you have a lower chance of getting your cancer back, and the risk decreases as you drink more coffee. But here you can see that at 8 cups of coffee per day, your risk is fairly low, but the confidence interval is also very wide, which means that technically, on average, you have a lower risk. But if you're a patient who drinks 8 cups of coffee a day, you can also fall here with a higher risk or here with a lower risk. And so this is because there are very few people who drink 8 cups of coffee a day, so they have very little data on that. So every data they get cannot really be extrapolated. For example, if you ask a question to 2 people and you say, oh, this is how the entire population think, you can realize that you are probably wrong. Whereas if you ask 10,000 people a question and you say, oh, okay, so this is how the population think, there you might be a little bit more accurate. And this is exactly what's happening here. They have very few people, so they have very low confidence that this data is actually accurate. Also, very important point, sure, drinking more cups of coffee seems to lower your risk of you getting your colorectal cancer back, but it also increases the risks of getting other problems. For example, any heart damage. So pick your battle carefully, please. Thank you. So for all mortality causes, x-axis, same thing, y-axis, same thing, except we are not talking about the risk of having your cancer back, we are talking about the risk of dying from anything. And here the data is a little bit more sure of itself, because you can see that the dotted lines follow very closely the black results line. Also, they are fairly close to each other, and they both are below the threshold of 1, which means same risk. So this result is fairly significant. And you can see that between 3 and 5 cups of coffee per day, you have a much lower risk of dying when you are a colorectal cancer patient living in the Netherlands. This is a very small population. It cannot be extrapolated to the entire population. But here you can see that the optimal when you have a colorectal cancer is 4 cups per day. Overall, can you trust this paper? Yes, they seem to have made quite a good job of finding a big population of people, trying to exclude factors that could contribute, and their results are significant. Second question, should you drink 8 cups of coffee a day? No, because even though it seems like you might reduce the risk of getting your colorectal cancer back, if you have one, you also increase your risk of dying from something else entirely. If you have another cancer, should you drink more coffee? This paper cannot tell you. Maybe, maybe not. You have to look at the research on your specific cancer to make sure that you are not deteriorating your health, because things that are true for one cancer are not true for another cancer. Cancers are very different. Let's go back to the tweet now. Is it accurate? No, not even a little bit, because the first paper was not even talking about coffee. It was talking about 2 different administration protocols of chemotherapy, but still chemotherapy. And the second paper is talking about patients who have done their treatment, so most likely a little bit of chemotherapy, and then drink coffee afterwards. So no, you cannot replace your chemotherapy with coffee. It will not work and you will die. Please don't. Thank you very much. So what I can take from this tweet is that the person who wrote it did at best misinterpret the data because he didn't read it properly, and at worst made a claim that could be fatal for people. So please follow what your doctor recommends. Take your chemo if that is what is recommended to you. And maybe if you had colorectal cancer, drink a little bit more coffee. Little bit. Thank you so much for watching. This was Science Breakdown. I hope you stick around. I hope you stay curious. And if you have any wants on what we should treat next, please let me know.